Graham Phillips is an historical detective and author of so many great books that we've discussed in depth on this show before, such as The Lost Tomb of King Arthur, Merlin and the Discovery of Avalon and the New World, Alexander the Great, Murder in Babylon, Robin Hood, The Man Behind the Myth, and The Shakespeare Conspiracy. Today, we continue with his newest, Wisdomkeepers of Stonehenge, the living libraries and healers of megalithic culture. In this latest book, Graham presents compelling evidence that the famous monument was built as an ancient healthcare facility and that its creators had developed natural remedies for ailments and diseases which still thwart modern medicine, possibly even a cure for cancer. My God, man, what are you smoking?
I don't actually smoke anything, to be quite honest with you.
Much like Jack the Ripper, this is one of those mysteries that may never be solved. And I've heard it all. It's a UFO landing portal. It's a calendar. It's a grave site built for kings. It was a place where Druids practiced in levitation. If you ask our good friend Geoffrey of Monmouth, it was built by the giants. But I've honestly not once heard that it was some sort of naturopathic clinic. We'll get to how you've come to this conclusion later in the show. Now, Stonehenge is not the only Henge monument. There's also Avebury. Which came first, Stonehenge or Avebury?
Well, to start off with, stone circles started to be built in Britain around about 3100 BC. And ultimately, there was thousands of them. I mean, not just Stonehenge is the most famous, obviously, but there were many, many more. There's over 1,000 still survive today in various states of preservation. And Stonehenge isn't the largest. What you just mentioned now, Avebury Stone Circle, is much bigger. Stonehenge is about 100 feet across. Avebury is 1,000 feet across. It consisted of around 100 stones around the outside, some of them weighing up to 40 tons, which is 3 or 4 times heavier than the largest of Stonehenge's stones. Around Avebury, there was built a massive great ditch and embankment about 40 feet deep and 40 feet high, cut out of solid chalk. Inside the actual massive stone circle, there were smaller stone circles built inside it. In fact, it is so big that it surrounds an entire village today. And you can actually buy houses and live inside the monument of Avebury. That's how big it is. But incredibly, it's about 20 miles north of Stonehenge, but most people just don't know of it. Stonehenge is unique in as much as it has those lintel stones creating arches all the way around it, whereas Avebury and the many other stone circles in Britain don't have those. So Stonehenge is a unique monument, but it is far from the biggest. I mean, Avebury is the largest, but there are many others almost the size of Avebury throughout the whole country. And they basically were built around about the same time. So you asked which came first, Stonehenge or Avebury. They were both built around the same time in stages between about 3000 BC and about 2500 BC. And it seems that they were built by separate tribes, if you like, using the same technology. Incredibly, they were still in the Stone Age, and they were using antlers for picks, from animal antlers for picks. They were using stone axes. They were using wicker baskets to carry the dirt away. And with nothing more than Stone Age tools, thousands of people worked day after day, year after year, to create these incredible monuments, to cut the stones, to move them to where they were, to erect them, to build this great ditch and this embankment around Avebury. And it seems that there's 2 separate tribes. One decided to build the most impressive monument in the country, i.e. Stonehenge with its arches, and the other, the people at Avebury, about 20 miles north, decided to stagger the population of Britain by building such a huge monument. So they went for size, where the Stonehenge builders went for something more elaborate.
Well, there must have been some collusion between the 2 tribes, however, to have timed it so well.
Well, if you actually go back, the whole of the timing of the building of stone circles and the development of them coincides all around the country. It begins around 3100 BC, not in the south of England where you'd expect, with people coming over from France, because at that time Britain was much, there was the sea levels were lower. because so much of the ice from the Ice Age hadn't melted. So it didn't take much to get a little boat across the much narrower straits between France and Britain as it does take today. So people were coming to Britain, they were settling in Britain from continental Europe, from France, Belgium, the Netherlands. But that's where you'd expect this stone circle building tradition to start, but it doesn't. It starts in the very north of Britain, on the Orkney Isles to the north of Scotland. And the first stone circle there was built around 3100 BC. And it consists of it was 12 stones. They were quite tall, about 15 feet high, in a circle about 100 feet across. So it was a kind of like a Stonehenge, but without the lintel stones along the top causing the arches. That was built, and then very quickly, the building of these stone circles, some of them small, some of them large, and it moved southwards throughout Scotland, England, across into Ireland, and within about 100 years, there were stone circles of various sizes being built all over the British Isles. And the new developments, for example, they started with fairly simple stone circles. Then they started adding ditches and embankments around them. And those are what's called a henge. The actual henge in Stonehenge is the ditch and embankment surrounding it. Like I mentioned, there is at Avebury. Stonehenge is smaller, but a lot of the larger stone circles have these ditches and embankments around them. And also, complexes, megalithic complexes as they're called, like Stonehenge and Avebury and others, were not just the stone circle, but avenues of stones that went on for a couple of miles in various directions away from the stone circle. They also built artificial hills, like, for example, at Avebury, there's a massive artificial hill about 130 feet high, and that's been eroded over thousands of years, so it was much higher, that was built called Silbury Hill, which was built very near to Avebury. It's part of the megalithic complex of earthworks and standing stones, not just the circle itself. And these started to occur simultaneously in Scotland, Ireland, and England, and in Wales around about 2500 BC. So even though the country was divided into separate tribes of people using primitive tools with no central authority or government, people continued to develop the stone circle building tradition in tandem throughout the whole British Isles.
Is there any practical purpose to the henge itself?
Yeah, well, the actual henge itself, it's a real mystery.
Yeah.
The idea is it seems to have been created as a moat, and so therefore the ditch would have originally been filled with water. But it would only be filled with water at certain times of the year because a lot of these stone circles are built in chalky areas, and chalk isn't very good at holding water. It will seep through into the chalk. So it would only really fill with water at times of heavy rainfall. So it's unlikely. Some people suggest it might have been a moat for some kind. It's certainly not built for protection. If you actually create a hill fort and you want to be protected from the attacking forces, you build a moat outside the embankment, and then on top of the embankment you build a stockade. Well, this is built backwards. It's got the ditch inside the embankment, which is ridiculous. It can't have been built for defensive purposes because it's built inside out. Whatever it's built for, it either has some religious purpose or some other significance, which is still a mystery.
Is it possible the henge was used for drainage so as to ensure the stones remained in place?
Not really, because they're kind of, if we're talking about these chalk areas, which is a lot of southern England, where the biggest of these stone circles is like Stonehenge and Avebury, water doesn't really build up very much on top of chalk because it's porous. So you're not going to get flooding. You go to Avebury now and you wander around after heavy rainfall, and you can still wander around the ditch and not get your feet that wet.
It's almost as though they knew what they were doing, placed in perfect locations.
Yeah, for some, they obviously had some sort of religious significance, but that doesn't seem to be...
Whoa, wait. Now, why is that obvious?
Well, because if you take every civilization that's ever existed, They all build things that we know about anyway. They all build things for religious purposes. It seems to be a kind of hot wired into the human mind to want to create religious structures. You've got the ancient Egyptians and their temples. You've got the great cathedrals of medieval Europe. You've got temples in India and China. And so wherever you go in the world, people seem to, ancient civilizations became religious. So if you can't work out a practical function for something, then you tend to say, well, it's got to be religious in some way. But there are certain things about the stone circles which suggest that they were built for a practical purpose and not just for religious purposes. There may have been religious aspects to it, like the people who added the ditches and the big hills, who knows? But there definitely seems to be something other than religious about most of the stone circles. The reason I say this, and this is something that tends to have been overlooked by archaeologists and researchers in the past, which is fairly obvious when you look at the history of them, to say that they weren't religious and they had a practical purpose. That's because during the period that stone circles were built, which is a period of around about 3,000 years, from around 3,100 BC till when the Romans turned up, around 50 BC. So, and then when the Romans invaded, about a century after that. So when the Romans turned up, the stone circles stopped being built. So you've got a 3,000-year period. If it was just one lot of people that were building these things, you'd say, yeah, okay, they're building it like the ancient Egyptians built the same kind of temples, like the Christians built the same kind of churches. But these lots of different people came to Britain during this period, settled here, had completely different customs and religious practices, and they still continued to build, maintain, and use the stone circles alongside the native Britons. Now, how do we know this? Well, the first group of the people who actually started building the stone circles are known as the Neolithic Britons. They'd come over to Britain after the last ice age, so they'd been here for some time. Around about 2,500 BC, a new people arrived in Britain. They're known as the beaker culture. The reason being is they buried their dead in the ground holding a beaker or cup, hence the beaker culture. That was obviously, when you the way people bury their dead obviously reflects their religious ideas in some way. So they buried their dead in the ground with these beakers. Now, the people before that buried their dead in the ground, but they built earthen tumuli over them, small mounds. These new people, the beaker people, who came across from what is now Belgium, when they first came here, they started burying their dead differently. They didn't bury mounds, they just buried their dead in the ground with these beakers. Different religious practices that they kept up. And we know from the archaeological evidence that they were involved with using the stone circles because their burials are found around them. Then, a few hundred years later, there arrived a new culture known as the Wessex culture. They came from what's now the Netherlands. They buried their dead differently. They buried their dead in a small kind of stone coffin in the ground that they created from stones, flat stones, put the body in it and then covered it up and put mounds over the top. Again, different to the two previous lots of people that were still in Britain, the beaker people and the native Neolithic people. So they buried their dead differently, but still used the stone circles. Then came the Urnfield culture from what is now Austria. They eventually arrived in Britain. They're called the Urnfield culture because they burnt their dead, they cremated their dead, put their ashes in urns and buried them in fields or cemeteries. And then much later on, you've then got the Celts arriving in Britain from what's now Germany. And what they did is they buried their dead. Usually they either cremated their dead or buried them in the ground, but the highest ranking people were buried under what they call cairns, which are great big piles of rocks. So you've got all these different groups of people arriving in this country, completely different religious practices if the way that their burials are anything to go by. And they all continued to use the stone circles. So there's no form of writing until the Romans turned up, so we don't know why they were using the stone circles. But because so many different people from different religious backgrounds were involved in using the stone circles, repairing them, building new ones, and so forth, it suggests that they had some practical rather than religious function.
Stone circles go back more than 5,000 years, but what are some of the earliest known writings of these megalithic monuments?
The earliest writings in Britain don't occur until the time of the Greeks and Romans, when they first visited the country.
So this was all as much of a mystery to them as it is to us.
Absolutely, yes. Except some of the early explorers from Rome and from Greece. Before the Roman invasion actually took place in 43 AD, but the first attempt to invade Britain was in 55 BC when Julius Caesar came here, but the locals sent him packing. He didn't really have a big enough army and he had enough trouble back home, so he left. So from about 55 BC, you've got Romans visiting Britain to trade, and they wrote about Britain, and so did the Greeks who came with them. Now, they say that what they learn is from the people who were using the stone circles when they turned up, are people that are known as the Druids. Now, you get modern day Druids, people who dress up in white robes and go to Stonehenge on the summer solstice, which is today, but the summer solstice, incidentally, today is not taking place because of the lockdown. So in other words, there's no Druids meeting at Stonehenge, supposedly, but they may have done. I don't know. If they did, they were breaking the law. That the Druids that existed at the time when Julius Caesar came to Britain and the other Romans were very different from the modern Druid. Modern Druidism only started in the 19th century as a sort of offshoot of Freemasonry. People had learned about the Druids. They thought, well, let's dress up in these white robes and carry out ceremonies and do poetry contests and singing and so forth. We don't really know what the original Druids believed other than what the Romans tell us. And they don't seem to have been a sort of a Masonic type order, if you like. From what we've learned from what the Romans tell us, they were not just men. They were men and women and children. There were families of Druids. They were kind of like a kind of hierarchy, a sort of not so much a priesthood, but a priestly caste of people who you were chosen to become a Druid as a child. Like the Druids would turn up in your village and they would say, okay, we want that child. Sort of like the Buddhists choose a new Lama in Tibet, or at least used to. And these children would then go off and they would train, according to Julius Caesar, for 20 years to become a Druid. Then they would marry a Druidess if they were a man, or the Druidess would marry a Druid. They would actually marry others who had been trained likewise. And then they'd have children, and these children would be trained from birth. Now, we don't know whether all of the children of the Druids were automatically Druids or whether some of them were kicked out, but we certainly know that new children were being brought into the Druid fold all the time. Now, Britain at the time the Romans turned up was pretty much, as archaeology has suggested, it had been for 3,000 years, divided into lots of different tribes who each had their own chieftain. The Druids seem to have existed outside of ordinary tribal society and were, at least people thought originally, were a Celtic priesthood of some type. But there were men and women who lived in remote monastic communities, although you're probably not monastic because they were involved in getting married and involved with each other, where they weren't just separated the men from the women. They all lived together in these communities, these communes. But when there was a dispute in a tribe about who was going to take over or about who owned what land or so forth, it would be a Druid who would come to the town or come to the village, the settlement, and would adjudicate. So the Druids were looked up to, Julius Caesar and other generals, Roman generals, describe how they would witness battles between two separate tribes that would literally grind to a halt when the Druids passed through. They would all sort of put down their weapons and wait until the Druids passed by and then carry on fighting. This is the kind of esteem in which the Druids were held. Now, until very recently, everybody assumed that the Druids were a Celtic priesthood because they exist in France as well, in Gaul, which was also a Celtic place. But the thing is that Julius Caesar tells us, who actually conquered Gaul, that the Druids in France had come from Britain. They were basically a British phenomenon. And these Druids, it seemed, from what what the Romans tell us, were buried in a very special type of tomb, very often close to stone circles. And the tombs they were buried in were called box tombs. They were different from any other kind of tomb. They were sort of, I mean, the average size was about 6 feet wide, 18 feet long, 5 or 6 feet high, a series of long flat stones placed around the edges, causing a kind of rectangular box. The middle was divided into two. The bodies were buried in the one side, grave goods in the other, and then flat stones were placed upon the top, and then the whole thing was covered by a mound. Now, these Druids were buried in these type of box tombs. The Romans tell us this, archaeology shows this. But the interesting thing, and this is where historians for a long time had got things wrong, thinking that the Druids had just started with the Celts who came to Britain around 700 BC. Box tombs go all the way back to the beginning. There were box tombs being built next to stone circles with obviously high status individuals being buried in the one side and their grave goods in the other, all over the country, right from the time when the first stone circles were built around 3100 BC. So it seems as though what the Romans referred to as the Druids, or the Celts did, had in fact been an elite caste of people who were somehow associated with using the stone circles all the way through the period that the stone circles were built, the whole megalithic age, as it's called.
When you say they allowed the Druids to safely pass through, it reminds me of the medical neutrality we have for war, where neither side is allowed to shoot upon the enemy's medical personnel.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's fascinating about the Druids is they were respected above all else as being healers. Now, we know this from what the Romans tell us. They say that the Druids had a knowledge of all sorts of medicinal plants that they were able to use. Now, the Romans are pretty good at surgery and pretty good at medicines compared to other ancient civilizations. And what the Druids were doing was baffling them. They couldn't understand quite how the Druids were creating some of these concoctions, if you like, from medicinal substances that were cures for all sorts of things, all sorts of different ailments. They had things to rub on wounds as some sort of antiseptic. They had cures for stomach problems, cures for asthma, headaches. They had analgesics. They had all sorts of medicinal plants that they used, plant extracts. And they kept this a pretty well guarded secret as to how they actually did this. The Roman writer Pliny the Younger, or was it Pliny the Elder? Anyway, one of them, in the 1st century AD, he actually wrote about, one of the only ancient accounts of exactly how the Druids prepared one particular potion. And he says that they actually had a cure for tumours. And what he describes has to be what today we would call cancer, or different types of cancer. Tumours, certainly. And this particular cure involved mistletoe. And he says that they cut the mistletoe at a very particular time of the year, and not only on a particular period of the year, but on a particular phase of the moon. And he couldn't understand why they had to actually wait until the moon was in a particular position in the sky to cut this mistletoe. And they cut it and prepared this particular extract that they then used to cure tumours. In other words, if he's right, from mistletoe they had the cure for cancer. Now, what's astonishing is today a particular substance used in chemotherapy, only very recently, and it's been very successful, is actually obtained from mistletoe. So, that's astonishing that they were able to know this, certainly 2,000 years ago. Now, what's fascinating is, why were they actually cutting it? Pliny thought that it was probably some religious reason that they had to cut it when the moon was in a particular place. But that's not necessarily true. The mistletoe, like all plants, tends to, the chemicals that the different parts of the plant give off, the roots, the fruit, the leaves, the stems and so forth, can often change. They do change throughout the year. So to cut a particular plant to get the right kind of chemical extract, you need to harvest that particular part of the plant at a very particular time of the year very often. But sometimes the phases of the moon do count. Why? Because the moon attracts pollinating moths. When a moth pollinates the plant, the flower of the mistletoe plant, it does so when the moon is in a particular position in the sky. This attracts moths. This moth then knows, right, I'm going to go and get the nectar from this particular plant. It fits in when moths also when they also reproduce. It's all part of their life cycle. So the moon was very important for the moths when they pollinated the plants. And it was at this time that the Druids decided they needed to cut this particular plant when it was producing the scent, the chemical that attracted the moths. And how did they know when this was going to be? Well, because it could change, but it didn't change as far as the moon was concerned. They knew when the moon was in a certain position, that's when to cut this mistletoe. So it were pretty amazing stuff, really. But it wasn't just with mistletoe that they were actually cutting these plants. Archaeologists know from the extracts of various medicinal substances found within the grave goods in these box tombs, the pots that they kept their potions in, if you like, that the certain extracts could only be taken from particular plants when the moon was in a certain position, because that's when they were producing this substance to attract pollinating insects. So it was essential for them to not only know a particular time of the year, but particular phases of the moon. So how on earth did these Druids, who seem to have been creating these medicinal substances for 3,000 years, and we know this because archaeologists have excavated the tombs, 3000 BC tombs, and found the medicinal substances in the jars and pottery found as grave goods in these box tombs. They know that they'd been somehow able to figure out when exactly the right phase of the moon was, what exact time of the day or night it was of the year. How on earth were they doing this when they didn't have clocks or modern calendars? This is where the stone circles come in.
How long did the Druids exist for, and what happened to them? I mean, it would have taken a long time to have amassed this amount of knowledge.
Well, we know they were called Druids from around about 700 BC, which is what the Celtic people who had pretty much taken over Britain at the time called them. But it seems that when they came to Britain, the Druids were already here. They may have been using another name. And because they had these amazing abilities for curing ailments, they decided to adopt them as their own priesthood. But they'd already existed throughout a period of time when many other cultures, as I mentioned before, like the Beaker people, the Wessex culture, the Urnfield culture, had come here. They saw these people as, wow, they've got, we're not going to get rid of them. They mean us no harm. They're great healers. We'll keep them on. If that's the case, and the box tomb burials seem to suggest exactly that, then the Druids existed from at least 3100 BC, probably started on the Orkney Islands to the north of Britain, and they carried on until the Romans came. Now, in 43 AD, the Roman Emperor Julius Caesar decided to invade Britain. And this didn't happen overnight. It took about 20 years altogether for them to conquer most of what's now England and Wales and establish the country Britannia. Before that, it had been called Albion. So they established Britain as we know it today. In 60 AD, the Roman Emperor Nero, who was continuing the conquest of Britain, kept getting news that the British were fighting back against the Romans and managing to beat them. At one point, the British warrior queen, Boudicca, managed to wipe out an entire Roman legion, which just hadn't happened before. Not by, Augustus Caesar had lost a couple of legions by trying to invade what's now Russia, but failed that one. But in a country they'd already half conquered, to lose an entire legion was just not on. And the reports he got back from his general in this country, in Britain, was that the people who were causing the various squabbling tribes of Britons to unite together as one fighting force were these Druids, who they greatly respected. So Nero ordered that all the Druids be wiped out. And in 61 AD, the Romans basically wiped out the Druids, pushed them all into an island in the north of Wales and the west of Britain called Anglesey. And a Roman writer called Tacitus describes how they were all cut down and killed. Men, women and children, these Druids, were all killed by Nero. So basically, that's the end of the Druids in 61 AD.
This Nero is a bad guy. I never hear anything positive about him.
Well, he was a madman, basically. Well, he was not so much mad. I mean, Caligula was totally mad. He was a Roman emperor that made his horse a senator and decided to declare war on the sea god Neptune. So, no, he was mad. But Nero was more sort of greedy. He set fire to Rome in order to clear an area so he could build a new palace, and then blamed it on the Jews. Some people say he blamed the Christians, but there really weren't that many Christians around then. He basically blamed everybody else. Ultimately, Nero was such a complete mess for Rome that his generals revolted against him and he committed suicide. And for the next year, there was what called the year of the three emperors. Three generals made themselves Roman emperor for a couple of months, got killed off. Another one came along. But after that, it was mainly generals who ruled Rome, not members of the Caesar family, although they were referred to as Caesar. And they came from all over the emperor. The Emperor Hadrian that built a great wall across the north of Britain, he came from Spain. There was a black emperor known as Africanus. So they came from all over the empire after that. But Nero basically was kind of like the end of the Caesars, the end of the mad emperors. But he was the one who was responsible for getting rid of the Druids. Some people said that some of the Druids still survived in wild areas of Britain. And many years later, when the Roman Empire collapsed and the Romans left Britain in the 400s, one of the people who is said to have been a descendant of these Druids, one of the last surviving
Merlin?
Druids, was none other than absolutely Merlin.
Yeah. I saw where that was going.
You can see where that one was going.
Yeah. That's so cool. Let me ask you, so all the clues that are amassed about Stonehenge, what lies beneath? I'm assuming they've used ground-penetrating radar and looked into the earth. What's underneath Stonehenge?
Yeah, I mean, the people are buried in and around Stonehenge, but it doesn't seem to have been used itself as an actual burial site.
Yeah, but they could have been buried there well after it was built.
Yeah, well after it was built, absolutely. What they've discovered, there's nothing under it. These TV shows you see when, you know, people go under Stonehenge and there's a great big cavern down there with all sorts of magical stuff in it. There's nothing like that. But what ground-penetrating radar has shown from an archaeological point of view is that the stones were quite often moved. The first Stonehenge that was built in around 3000 BC consisted just of standing stones. In a larger circle, I think there was 56 of them. They've actually found the holes where the stones were originally put. When stones were put somewhere in the ground and then dug up later and moved, earth is put back in to, or fills in the hole. Ground penetrating radar and other types of geophysics equipment can tell where the ground's been disturbed, and you can get a map of the holes that have been filled in. So they know where the stones were placed. And there's about 56 of them placed in a great big circle, larger than the actual outside of the stone circle there is now. It's about 150 feet in diameter as opposed to 100 feet, I think, if I remember rightly. And these stones, because of the size of the holes, they know that they fit exactly with stones that now lie within the stone circle that now exists with the arches around it at Stonehenge. So they know that those stones were originally built on the outside. They can date it because they dig down into the soil to the bottom of where the earth had been moved, the bottom of the pits. They take samples of organic matter from there, bits of bone, bits of pollen and so forth. They can then carbon date this particular organic remains and work out how old it is. So they know that the original stones were put in these holes around about 3000 BC. So that's 5,000 years ago. Now, so they know they're the same shape and size as stones that now lie within the main big circle at Stonehenge. So they were moved later on. Now, this original Stonehenge, made up of these stones inside Stonehenge now, are known as blue stones. They're about 6 feet high each. And what's fascinating is they originally came not from anywhere around Stonehenge, but from South Wales, about 150 miles to the west.
Preseli Hills.
It's Preseli Hills, absolutely. Now, why exactly these were moved all the way from there is unknown. There was, now archaeologists have realised they found a site where these particular stones were excavated. They've matched them up. They've matched up the stones to a quarry in the hillside. You've got the rocks there. You can actually see some stones that have been cut out and had broken and had been left there when they were quarrying them around about 3100 BC. And nearby where this quarry is, they found the remains with geophysics geophysics surveys have shown that these stones originally were in a stone circle in South Wales, 150 miles to the west of Stonehenge. And for some reason, when the people from South Wales decided to migrate to central southern England, where Stonehenge is, they decided to uproot their stone circle and bring it with them. Now, people think, well, they dragged them all the way over 150 miles of, on rollers. Well, not necessarily. Where this stone circle is in South Wales is quite near the sea. They could have put them on barges, sailed them around the coast of Wales, and then down the rivers all the way to within about 20 miles of Stonehenge. So it's possible that they moved them on barges and then hauled them to where they were and put them in position. That's possible. But why they decided to bring this so-called blue stone, because it looks a bluish colour when it's wet, all the way from South Wales to build the original Stonehenge, who knows? Such a thing isn't known elsewhere. Normally, when stone circles are built, people use stone that's locally available. So that's a mystery. But the thing is that you mentioned a bit at the beginning about how Geoffrey of Monmouth, in his story about Merlin, says that giants built Stonehenge. It's called the Giant's Dance, and he said it was originally built by giants, but then moved to where it is at Stonehenge. He says from Ireland, but he does say, and Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote in 1150, and he's one of the first people to write about King Arthur and Merlin in the Middle Ages. He tells us that the stones of Stonehenge were originally moved from somewhere else to there. Well, he's absolutely right. He said it was Ireland. It happens to be Wales. But he must have got that story that had been passed on from year after year by the local people who live near Stonehenge, which is quite incredible because he's there 4,000 years after the original Stonehenge was built.
The part that I can't quite understand, I can see how you could erect the vertical stones, but the lintels themselves, that baffles me.
It took a lot of people a lot of time to figure it out. It's actually really quite simple. People will imagine great big sort of earthen ramps that they actually pull these things up, but there's no evidence of soil being disturbed around them for that to have happened. Then they've tried other ways of trying to hoist them up, and archaeologists have managed to sort of very slowly try and hoist up stones and then get them on the top, but it didn't need any of that. They simply waited until the snows came, built snow ramps and pulled them up that. And the reason we know this is because something very similar has been found in Siberia, and the local people told the archaeologists exactly how those stones were put on top of others by dragging them up snow ramps. That leaves absolutely no evidence behind.
Oh, that's brilliant. It's like a great magic trick when David Copperfield made the Statue of Liberty disappear. Once you know how it's done, it's
not very good.
It's like, is it? Well, that's not that great.
It's once you know how a lot of these things are done, they sort of think, oh, that's not very interesting. People then still much prefer the idea of levitation or spaceships, I think. But the interesting thing about Stonehenge is the original stone circle that was built, that I said was just ordinary standing stones, nothing on top of them. When around 2500 BC, when the much bigger stone circles like Avebury and other stone circles like Avebury were being built, the people of Stonehenge obviously decided they wanted to impress the people with an elaborate structure that didn't necessarily, all the other stone circles managed perfectly all right for their purpose without these lintel stones on top. But when they did this, they built these outer stones, with the big stones with the archways, the lintels on top. They moved these stones from the outer stone circle and placed them in like a horseshoe shape and another ring inside the new stone circle they had built. And then built some other really big standing stones inside the circle with stones on top. And then you get the Stonehenge that we know today. And so that's how Stonehenge eventually ends up looking like, well, it's fallen down now, but looking like its ultimate shape around 2500 AD, which is exactly the same time as they're also building Avebury. They're probably able to build these bigger stone circles now that they weren't before because of the new influx of the Beaker people. The Beaker people not only brought with them more people, the population of Britain was increasing, they also brought bronze. So although it doesn't seem that bronze antlers and bronze axes were being used rather than Stone Age antlers and stone things to actually Stone Age tools to build the stone circles, they had metal tools which made farming a lot easier. People were fed more, the population increased.
Of course, so there had to be settlers at these locations in order to sustain the people that were working on the monuments.
Yes, and it's because of that, because we know these people settled alongside the native Britons and worked alongside them. We find their graves together around settlements, so we know they worked together. So we know they both must have been working on the stone circles. In other words, certainly the Beaker people must have been, because they left their remains at Stonehenge. Specific Beaker burials, people buried with the Beaker cups holding them in a kind of fetal position, which is the way they buried their dead, are found around Stonehenge. So we know that they were involved in stuff. So they arrived with a completely foreign culture, with a different form of religion, because they had a different way of burying the dead. That's one way how you can tell how if someone has a different sort of religion. And yet they thought, right, we're going to use these stone circles too, which suggests they had to have had more than just a religious significance.
Much like the Valerium that partially covered the Roman Colosseum, which of course has deteriorated over time, or the Great Pyramid of Giza that was covered in limestone. As Stonehenge looks now, is that how it would have looked then? Or is it like the snow, it melts away and there's no sign of any evidence?
Well, the rain over the years, rainfall will have actually got rid of any evidence of anything else. Whether they actually whitewashed the stones, whether they painted them with some sort of pigments, or whether they actually covered them in some sort of animal skins at various times of the year, we just don't know. There is no evidence for it one way or the other. But I can imagine that there's it's like when you see the great cathedrals in Britain that were built during the Middle Ages. You look at all these stone statues, they're pretty impressive. But what people forget is that during the Middle Ages, all these statues were painted in live colours. The skin was like skin tones. The clothes they wore on the statues, they're painted blue, red, green, or whatever colours they had. These statues, the whole of these cathedrals would have been extremely colourful places, where now they just look like sort of like cold stone monuments. So it's possible that Stonehenge was painted or whitewashed or something.
Wow. Again, with the vertical stones, are they dowelled in?
Basically, if you see a standing stone, like in Britain, you've got the stones of stone circles, and you've got solitary standing stones sometimes in between stone circles that form kind of alignments across the countryside. Some people call those ley lines, believing that they were channeling some sort of energy. They may have been processional ways, who knows? But whenever you see a megalithic stone, one of these stones erected by the people of Britain that I'm talking about, whatever height it is above the ground, obviously with erosion has made it be slightly less high, slightly less tall than once it was. But you can say roughly that whatever height you see above the ground, there's a third again below the ground. They dug holes and then tipped them into it and filled around the holes. So if you've got a third as much below the ground as you've got above, it stays standing upright.
Gotcha.
How long would these projects have taken to build?
Well, like Stonehenge, as I was saying, the outer stone circle was built by one lot of people. But it was 500 years later before they decided to erect the stones that we now see today and move the other stones inside. But Stonehenge, there was other bits added on over a few hundred years after that. But the main part of Stonehenge that we see today, the Stonehenge that we imagine, was built probably in around about 30 years by probably 20 or 30,000 people actually being involved in the project. they were mobilizing vast numbers of people, because for everybody who's chopping and picking away at a stone, remember, with sort of antlers or with another stone implement, and then they've got to cut them out of the rock, they've got to drag them to where they are, they've got to put them upright. And places like Avebury, with this massive great ditch and embankment around the outside, 40 feet deep and 40 feet high, cut out of solid chalk, they reckon the actual timing of how long it took can be carbon dated by the various. They're using animal antlers. These animal antlers break, so they leave them where they are. They bury them in the ground. They can be dated by carbon dating, radiocarbon dating. And so they know it's probably only 30 to 50 years that it took, probably again around about 30,000 people working all together to create Avebury. But Avebury doesn't just consist of the stone circle and the embankment and the ditch around it. There are other stone circles put inside it. They were put there later, maybe another 10 or so years to create those. Then you've got avenues of stones leading away from either side of Avebury to other smaller stone circles on nearby hills about 2 miles away. They were built later than that. So altogether, these things were built over a period of maybe 500 years in stages, but each stage seems to correspond with what's going on elsewhere in the country. When they're building avenues, stone avenues, basically standing stones about 50 feet apart, 6 feet high, about 40 feet apart avenue, 50 feet apart, the stones in each avenue, 6 feet high, running for pretty straight courses for about 2 miles to another stone circle, smaller one. When they appeared at Avebury, a couple of hundred years after the original stone circle was built, so at Stonehenge, a couple of hundred years after the Stonehenge main circle we now see is built, they added avenues on there, except they're nowhere to be seen anymore. The stones were taken down over the years. But elsewhere in the country, in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, all over the British Isles, you actually have people adding avenues at the same time. So there's new developments happening simultaneously. But when you get the great building of something like the original Avebury or the original Stonehenge, as I say, it seems to have been vast numbers of people involved in constructing them in very short periods of time, relatively. Britain is unique in having these stone circles, and these. What you end up with is what they call megalithic complexes, large stone circles surrounded by the Henge monument, which is the ring and embankment around the outside, the avenues of stones leading away to smaller stone circles, small satellite stone circles, huge great artificial hills that have got nothing inside them, no burial chambers, no nothing. They're just artificial hills that obviously have some purpose or other. These are built in areas and are considered to be megalithic complexes, a main stone circle with lots of other monuments around it from earth and stone. Stonehenge and Avebury are two of those. Then you've got, so they kind of are like the cathedrals, if you like. They were where the larger population centres were. Then in other areas, you've got smaller stone circles. Some stone circles have got stones that are only a couple of feet high and maybe 10 of them in a circle about 20 feet across. So that might be where your village parish church is, so to speak. So, but every kind of community seems to have had its stone circle as large as it could make, as impressive as it could make, depending on its population and its how it was thriving, you know, its food supply and so forth. So depending on the size of the population and the wealth of the area, the stone circles were bigger. But every little community had its stone circles, so they must have had some real significance. And this is where I come on to the whole idea of the Wisdomkeepers of Stonehenge.
Yeah, you know, one thing about the circle that interests me is that a circle itself suggests that the epicenter has some significance or importance.
Yes, you're absolutely right. It seems that since the 1960s, archaeologists have begun to realise that the stone circles, the stones are generally speaking not equally spaced. When they did equally space the outer stones, like at Avebury or Stonehenge, to make it look aesthetically pleasing, they then had to put other stones inside, smaller stone circles inside, in order to create some kind of sighting lines, it seems. Now, what they began to realize in the 1960s was that many stone circles, including Stonehenge, you stand in the middle of it, and certain stones are in certain positions that they, for example, many of the stone circles, nearly all of them, have an outlying stone, which is often known as a king or queen stone, which aligns with the setting or rising sun on the midsummer solstice, the midwinter solstice, or one of the equinoxes. In other words, an important day, the shortest or longest day of the year, the sun would rise or set beyond that stone. So you would have a calendar, if you like. It was giving you a particular time of the year. At Stonehenge, there's a stone called the heelstone, which is outside the main circle. And when you stand inside the stone circle on Midsummer's Day, when the sun rises, it rises over that stone. Now, gradually throughout the centuries, the Earth's tilt slightly changes, so it's called the precession of the equinoxes. So basically, after a period of time, the stones would actually fall out of alignment. And fascinatingly, from the geophysics surveys, they have found that, like the heelstone at Stonehenge, was gradually moved over the years, so it still remained in the right place when the sun rose. But the interest in the story about the heelstone is that the idea of calling it the heelstone is something that Geoffrey of Monmouth talks about. And the story of the heelstone is that local people believe that once the devil lived inside Stonehenge, and a friar came to, like a wandering monk, like Friar Tuck, a friar came to Stonehenge to exorcise the devil. The devil got annoyed. He picked up one of the huge stones and hurled it at the friar. The friar ran away, and it just missed him, hitting his heel and going into the ground, and where it remained ever since. And then it was originally called the Friar's Heelstone, later shortened to the heelstone. Interestingly, in ancient Greek, the word frios heel, friar's heel, frios heel, means rising sun. And it's probably that Geoffrey of Monmouth and others had read ancient Greek reports about this being the rising sunstone, and it got mistranslated, frios heel, into friar's heel, and somebody invented this story about the friar running away to name it, which is fascinating. But the thing is that a lot of these stone circles have these stones set so you can gauge when the midwinter is and the midsummer. But not only that, over the years, when archaeologists and other researchers have looked at stone circles throughout the country, they find that stones, prominent stones, align with particularly bright stars at particular times of the year. They also align with phases of the moon. At one point, an archaeologist suggested that Stonehenge and other stone circles were used as astronomical calculators so that the people could work out when to plant and sow and reap crops. Well, you don't need such an elaborate thing as a stone circle to do that. You just need a couple of stones, or some poles would do that. If you're going to have some elaborate series of stones in order to determine where the stars are, times of day and night, the phases of the moon, you've got to be making some pretty, if it is agricultural in nature, you've got to be making some pretty precise calculations indeed. And this is where the stone circles, everyone's been wondering, well, why would they need to make such precise calculations to reap and tend crops? Well, the reason is, if you were doing something like extracting certain chemicals from plants at very specific times of the year, phases of the moon, or particular times of the day and night, as I was talking about earlier, then something like the stone circles would be essential. So this is where I'm saying it seems to me that the stone circles were used as a way of calculating when they could, Pliny the Younger or Elder, whichever one he was, tells us about them cutting the mistletoe at a very particular time when the moon was in a particular position. They had to be able to work out when the moon would be in that position in advance. Hence the stone circles as an astronomical calculator. And as I say, there are many other plants where the various roots, the flower, the fruit and so on, has to be cut at a very specific time throughout the year. And it can change depending on where the moon is. because that then changes what the moths and other night pollinating insects are going to do. You're going to have to be ahead of where all the stars and the moon is and everything else at a very particular time. And that's where it seems the stone circles come in. For practical purposes, the stones are actually the actual calculating device. But because clearly these stone circles took on a meaning just beyond the healing part of things, the Druids obviously kept it very secret to themselves how they were doing all this. They probably did. People probably did come to the stone circles to be cured by the Druids, because the Druid settlements are always close to stone circles. The Druids are always being buried near the stone circles. So it's probably, it's part of a healthcare facility, but it may have also been the facility itself where people were brought to be given these concoctions, if you like.
Is there any archaeological evidence to support your theory?
The archaeological evidence to prove that these particular substances were being made is found in the box tombs. That's absolutely definite. They were able to do this. The fact that they were able to calculate the exact times in order to extract these substances from plants would need something like an astronomical calculator, such as the stones. But there is no actual proof at the moment. No one's actually dug up a picture of somebody using the stones in this way. We've only got what the Romans tell us, and the Romans tell us that they were using the stones in this way.
Fascinating stuff. I have an audience comment here that I'd like to get your opinion on. It could be total poppycock, but I don't know. Avebury is not an original stone circle. It was reconstructed in the 1930s. It was partly destroyed by the archaeologist Alexander Keeler, the Marmalade heir, who bought Avebury in 1934. Few will know that Avebury today is largely Keeler's creation. As well as knocking down buildings, he removed fences, dynamited trees, re-erected megaliths, and set concrete markers where he believed stones would have been.
Yeah, it's actually the whole stone circle was buried well before that time. The reason why Avebury survived, many stone circles throughout the country, especially the larger ones, were during the Middle Ages, throughout many years, people who didn't think that they were of any religious significance or anything else might chip away parts of the stones. They used them at Avebury, for example, to create stones to help build the church. So in the Middle Ages, a lot of the stones were destroyed. They were used as local building materials. And other stone circles, they were chipped away and used for bricks to make walls and things. Then during the Puritan era of Oliver Cromwell in the mid-1600s, the stones of Stonehenge, some local priest decided to have the whole things like pulled over. They were knocking them down. But what happened is that so a lot of the stones were actually smashed up completely during the Puritan era in the mid-1600s. But what had happened back in the Middle Ages is, because some local priest decided that the stones of Stonehenge of Avebury were the devil's work, they decided to actually dig pits, topple the stones into the pits, and cover them over again. So until very recently, a lot of the stones of Avebury were actually preserved, knocked over where they had fallen. And so after modern archaeologists or pseudo-archaeologists caused a lot of trouble and obviously moved a lot of stones around, in more recent years, a lot of the original stones have been preserved by the Christians of the Middle Ages, who wanted to destroy them by burying them, so they could be put back upright again in the places where they originally were. So a lot of the stones of Avebury are in their original place. Archaeologists are now able to do ground penetrating radar and other geophysics surveys to determine exactly and at what time various stones were in various places. So the modern idea, and some of the stones at Avebury are in the wrong place. But generally speaking, we know where the stones originally were, and a lot of them have been replaced where they were supposed to be. And the stone markers that are there now aren't necessarily the stone markers that this guy, the Marmalade Man, had put there. They're stone markers that modern archaeologists have put there. So we pretty much know now what it looked like.
Marmalade is horrific stuff. Oh my God. My dad tried to get me to eat that when I was a kid.
I don't much like it either.
Always a fascinating conversation, Graham. Wisdomkeepers of Stonehenge, the living libraries and healers of megalithic culture. I'm sure there is so much more to be learned in the book itself. I'd really like it if the audience would go to Amazon and pick up a copy. And of course, they can always visit your website, grahamphillips.net. If you're Googling for Graham Phillips, don't just put in Graham Phillips. You'll find some youth actor. Which show is he from?
He did Ben 10. He actually went out with Ariana Grande at one point, and I get a load of people writing to me saying, can I get them in touch with Ariana Grande?
Oh, boy.
But so that was a Graham Phillips, the actor. Put in Graham Phillips author. Type in Graham Phillips author, then you'll find me.
My respect for this other Graham Phillips just increased exponentially. Graham Phillips, you are also writing a new book. When will that be out? Do you know, next year maybe?
Yeah, next year. It's all about a mystical society that existed in the Victorian period that believed they possessed all sorts of ancient secrets. And the interesting thing is that following some of their diaries, I've actually managed to find stuff that they brought back from the Middle East and hid in the countryside of England.
I would love to chat with you about that when the time comes. Until then, Graham Phillips, thanks so much for being a guest once again on the Russell Scott Show.
Thank you very much indeed.